Welcome to everyone who's currently watching, and thank you, Neil and Aaron, both for being here today. How are you both?
Very well, thank you, Lucy.
Yeah, well, thanks, Lucy.
Good. So obviously we're here today to talk about the spring budget that was announced earlier today. Just to kind of kick things off then, what were your first impressions?
So if I pick that one up first, Lucy, I would say for me, Chancellor talked for just over 70 minutes. Didn't really cover actually huge amount of things that actually affect the average person in the street. But I think that the really interesting thing outside of all the big budgetary headlines is just the fact that they're now confident that they've got inflation moving on a downward trend. They stated that they think that we will hit the Bank of England's target for inflation of 2% within the next 2 months.
Okay.
And that's going to be really welcome news for the average person in the street, because it doesn't just mean falling in prices in the shops, but it also means pressure on the Bank of England to drop the Bank of England base rate, which then changes mortgage rates. And if we take anything out of the budget today, probably you'd look at it and say that's the news that has the biggest impact on people's pockets out of everything that there is. So that would be it for me.
Yeah, and for me, it wasn't so exciting, really. I kind of I thought there might have been a wee bit more in there that we'd not get our teeth into. But the biggest probably takeaway was around national insurance.
Yeah.
So the cuts to national insurance by 2%, that is going to have a knock on employers' pockets. That's going to be a benefit there. And also probably the changes to child benefit for those who are kind of working parents. So many people have kind of crept beyond that £50,000 earnings where the child benefit starts to be reduced. And that's going to be pushed back. That's certainly going to help people out who have children and are in that bracket.
Perfect. So what would you say were the kind of key pointers that you took away from his announcement? Can you explain these in a little more detail, please?
So yeah, I mean, I'll pick up the national insurance one. So Jeremy Hunt said before he announced what was already kind of widely publicised in the press for the last few days over the weekend, he said this is the pathway to a new, simpler, fairer tax system. He talked about the fact that ultimately he would hope that they would be able to remove national insurance completely, but that would be dependent upon the economy continuing to improve, debt levels continuing to improve, kind of the normal budgetary overspend each year, it continuing to improve. So he signalled a clear direction of travel for national insurance. If we then pick up the headlines around national insurance, for employed people, you've got the situation where we've got another 2% fall. So this time a fall from the current 10% to 8%, kicking in on the 6th of April. And it looks like your average employed person in a dental practice is going to be about £450 a year better off because of that one. For the performers in the practice, the self-employed people, again, a drop of 2% from 8% to 6%. Makes slightly less difference because obviously we're starting with a smaller figure initially. So probably makes them about £350 a year better off in terms of the national insurance that they're paying. But as Ian, the head of dental at Wesleyan, has already put out in his press statement, there's a little bit of a shame there that they haven't done anything about the employer's national insurance that the practice actually pays for all the practice staff. That's obviously a big drain on the business. It's a big annual cost for the business, and it would have been nice to have seen some reflective measure within national insurance to help those practices as well, but unfortunately nothing on that one.
Yeah, and on the child benefit piece, so kind of to echo what Neil said there around a simpler, fairer system, I think the gripe for a lot of people had always been that you could have a situation where you've got, let's say, a husband and wife couple who one of those is working and earning £50,000, the other one maybe isn't working, and they start to lose that child benefit for those earnings over £50,000. Okay. Whereas you potentially could be in a situation where the two parents are working, both earning £49,000 each, and they're retaining that whole child benefit, so it doesn't feel like a fair loss of that benefit really for those earning over £50,000. So they are pushing that back. So it's now going to be moved back to £60,000 will be the point whereby you start to lose child benefit. And the way that the taper works, they're going to gradually reduce the amount of child benefit you get. That's getting pushed back to £80,000. One thing that was mentioned, kind of watching the budget back, the they were mentioning how they're going to actually try to create a system whereby you can have like a system that'll assess like joint taxation on a household. At the minute, when you do a self-assessment, it's just for a single individual. I mean, that to me feels like a huge body of work to kind of, I don't know how that's going to be done, but it'd be quite interesting to see whether that is something that'll kind of creep in over time, that will have joint household taxation. So interesting.
So, I mean, they're the two main ones. If we kind of jump into the things that we giggle at that come back every single year under this government, you've got the freezing of alcohol duty and fuel duty for yet another year, which always gets a cheer in the Houses of Parliament when it's announced in a kind of ironic way, just because it's happened for so long now. You've got the change to the VAT threshold from 85,000 to 90,000. Not that that's particularly going to affect many dental businesses. I'd be surprised if it affects any. And then, Aaron, do you want to pick up the British ISA? That's the other big change.
Yeah, I mean, for us working in financial services, that's an interesting change. So there is going to be some ISA reform, kind of the launch of a British ISA. So it's going to sit on top of your normal ISA allowance of £20,000, and it's an additional £5,000 you can invest. There wasn't much on detail, so it sounds like the holdings within that ISA will have to be shares in, I guess, listed UK companies. It would be interesting to see kind of, like I say, a bit more detail. It's obviously going to be something that fund managers, investment houses are going to have to kind of get their heads around in terms of what assets can sit within that ISA. But it sounds beneficial. It's going to be an additional £5,000 that you can save in an area where it's going to be free of income tax and capital gains tax as well.
And I think that's a really interesting one, because what we've got in the UK at the moment within the tax system is a lot of the wealth taxes being made much tighter than they have been in the past. So capital gains tax bites far more quickly than it ever did. Certainly in the past 15 years that I've kind of been working in financial services for, you've got the savings allowance setting at a much lower point than when it was originally first introduced, and it's just slid down from that level ever since. So the announcement of another ISA allowance is actually potentially really beneficial, because I think for the first time last year, we probably saw lots of dentists having to pay tax on their savings held in bank accounts for the first time under self-assessment because of that slide down in the savings allowances. So that little bit extra ISA allowance might be helpful for dentists with capital in the bank.
Perfect. So you've touched on a lot of kind of interesting things there, but in general, looking at the budget, what would you say the impact is for the profession?
So I think I go back to what I said at the beginning, Lucy, really, which is that it feels like the biggest thing that's going to impact a dentist this financial year, and I'm going to have a big caveat here, outside of the kind of the rumoured potential May election, and the fact that if we get a May election and we got a change of government as is currently expected, you're probably repealing all of this conversation again in another 6 to 8 weeks' time, with much more change. So outside of that, that's my big caveat put away. You're probably looking at the fall in inflation and the expected fall in interest rates as having far more impact on the average person's monthly finances than anything that's actually set within the budget this year.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see kind of over these next probably couple of weeks how the mortgage market starts to move. Just to kind of echo what Neil said, we normally start to get emails from various lenders talking about rate reductions if there's anticipated falls in interest rates. So these next couple of weeks will be interesting. You know, for my clients, that's going to be something that I'll be keeping an eye on.
I suppose it's a funny one, really. Just thinking off the top of the head there, immediately you look at it and go, well, if inflation's falling and bank base rate starts to fall, it then links in quite nicely back to the British ISA again, in that people with money sat in accounts are going to start to see much lower levels of interest than they've seen in the last 2 years. And that should prompt them, along with the falling savings allowances, to think quite seriously about the British ISA and what it offers them. As well as just the standard ISA allowances as well, just making sure they're getting every single little pound of efficiency they can out of what they have held in capital.
Yeah.
So then just before we leave, is there anything that maybe was not covered that you would have liked to hear about?
So Aaron, do you want to go first or shall I go first?
I don't mind going first. So some of the kind of things that kind of weren't touched on so much were around income tax. Your personal allowance. There's been no change made to personal allowances for some time, so that stayed the same. Again, things like higher rate tax thresholds unchanged, dividend tax rates unchanged. So there's a fair few kind of tax nil rate bands which have sat at the same level for quite some time, whereas inflation, cost of living, that definitely has crept up over that time.
I think that's a really important one to highlight, Lucy. There's definitely, the government talks about cutting taxes and cutting national insurance to make people feel better off. But it knows at the same time that because it's doing nothing to increase the personal allowance, because it's not moving the tax bands in terms of where you kick on to a different percentage level, it creates a huge amount of fiscal drag. So more and more people every year, when they get the pay rises, when they work that little bit harder, are pulled into paying slightly heavier levels of tax regardless. So that little bit of saving with national insurance doesn't mean that much in real terms because they're constantly being pulled to higher and higher levels of tax. And when you look at the fact that the Chancellor's saying eventually he'll look to remove national insurance altogether, you can kind of understand why, because we know he's frozen those tax bands and allowances for several more years. So he's going to get the money either way almost. So it's a little bit of a game playing within that. So it definitely is a shame that there hasn't been something done in that area. I think I've said this on one of these budget reviews before. The one that I always think feels particularly punitive for dentists and for anyone working really is the fact that you've got the punitive removal of the tax-free allowance on income between 100,000 and 125,000 at the rate of 62.5 pence in the pound. And for anybody who's in that area, kind of the 100 to 125 mark, they need to really seriously be looking at some kind of pension planning where they can do, where allowances are available to do so, just to peel that money back and take it back off the taxman. It's some of the cheapest investment in your own future you'll ever get the chance to do. So that's a really big one. I think the other miss, which is a good thing, definitely a good thing, because you would look at it and say it'd be a little bit of a political own goal, but it was heavily rumoured, was changes around inheritance tax. So nothing announced around inheritance tax. And you would think that the Conservative government probably looked at the rumours and looked at the impact of doing something and thought it would be too much of an own goal to give to Labour with the run up to an election to start to remove some of the taxes that affect the wealthiest people in society, particularly given how much revenue they generate, several billions of pounds a year. So that was the other one that was expected but not seen.
So it kind of sounds like there was more left unsaid by the Chancellor than the things that he actually did say, which is a bit of a shame. But no, thank you both very much for taking the time to chat to me today, and I hope those watching found this very helpful. And yeah, thank you very much,
Lucy.